Kia ora and welcome to Cultured Conversations. My name is Kirsten Lacey and I am the director of the Auckland Art Gallery Toyo Tamaki. Cultured Conversations is a podcast that we've created to bring the voices of a whole range of different people leading in their sector in areas which are impacting culture today, whether that be government, policy, the arts, infrastructure, health, a whole range of different sectors. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Maria English, who is the CEO of Impact Lab. Impact Lab was created in 2019 by a data analyst, a policy advisor, ex-Prime Minister Bill English, also Maria's father, in order to provide NGOs with a way in which they could assess and evaluate their social impact, particularly of the programs that they're delivering to New Zealanders. Welcome, Maria. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So perhaps if we could start with, why did this company get founded?
Yeah, it's a fair question. So I guess it was founded really because people from different angles were asking a similar question, which is how do we make our investment really work for the communities that we care about when it comes to investing in the philanthropic and social sector? So in New Zealand, just pure philanthropic funding is about $4 billion a year and another $100 billion or more through government social service spending. And for almost none of that spending do we know where the investment's going, who it's really reaching, or what's the long-term difference that it's making to people's lives. So Impact Lab is really seeking to support both frontline charities and NGOs and those funding them to really get some information flow going so that we can both understand better the impact we're already having for our communities, but also to learn and improve it and do good better.
Now, you've only been going a few years, but you've already assessed 300 programs worth net $20 billion. You must have gained so much insights already. What can you tell us about social services in New Zealand?
Yeah, so it's I think it's 200 million of investment.
Oh, okay.
One day, hopefully, we'll get to 20 billion, but there's a wee ways to go. But we're learning so much. And in fact, we just produced our first insights report about the overall charity sector in partnership with Jarden Wealth Management. And what we learnt from that was a few things. I think one thing is that investment flows largely or a lot of it on the basis of the needs that people have. And when we look at the data, we see that there's 15% of New Zealanders who have particularly complex lives. They use half of all government services, and their needs are really complex and individualised, and often the mainstream services, education, health, don't work particularly well for people who are experiencing multiple forms of disadvantage. So that's where charities are stepping in often, and community organisations, to really provide connected, holistic, quite tailored support. And there's huge value that's generated for Aotearoa and for families from that work.
Maria, the work of Impact Lab is focused on measuring the social value. How do you set out to do that? I mean, you've got this down to a dollar figure per person.
Yeah, so the dollar figure is really useful because it enables us to say, for every dollar we're investing in this charitable program, this is the value we can estimate as returned to New Zealand. So it might be $2 for every dollar invested. So it's useful to link to the investment we're putting in, and it's specific, which is helpful. But it's also, just an estimate. So the way that we sort of come up with that is we think about the fact that people have a pathway of their lives. So they've got a past, a story of who they are and how they got to where they've got to. Then there's this opportunity that an organisation has to shift in a more positive direction the forward pathway that person's life takes. So we can often see from the data what pathways without support look like. We've just been working with a charity that supports young people who've been involved with the police and criminal offending. And the sad reality is, without support, many of those young people will go on to reoffend. And they might drop out of school and not end up with the kind of opportunities to support their aspirations. But if the right support can be provided, that pathway can shift in a more positive direction, and we can see outcomes like improvements in people's mental health, like improvements in educational attainment and employment, and reductions in the offending or the more negative outcomes that can occur for people. So social value is really about trying to estimate that difference between what would happen without support and how that could positively shift with effective support.
But how do you measure it?
Yeah, we've spent the last 4 years figuring that out, and I think it's an ongoing journey. So we combine 3 kinds of data. Data from community organisations about what they're doing and who they're reaching. Data from government about what pathways typically look like for certain populations and the value that can occur when pathways positively shift. And the third source is academic evidence. So there's often a wealth of existing academic evidence about how certain kinds of programs can lead to certain sorts of outcomes. And so we lean on that as well.
Okay, so you've got the social value per person that you've calculated, but then you've got to evaluate the program for an entire group. What happens next?
So we start by sitting down with the people delivering the program. So, for example, we worked recently with a disability employment service. So really sat down to understand who are they working with, how are they doing their work, and what are the outcomes that those frontline teams are seeing in people's lives. Then the next step is to kind of go to the public data and build out the model. So in that case, we wanted to understand the who. So it was people with long-term sort of on welfare for the long term with significant disabilities and access needs. We then looked at, okay, well, what's the model of support that's being provided? In this case, it was employment placement, so mentoring people, helping them apply for jobs, and then once they're in those jobs, supporting them to be successful in the workplace. So we then looked at the academic evidence to sort of see, well, how much long-term evidence is there and how good quality is the evidence that taking this kind of approach can lead to those long-term employment outcomes, but also improvements in things like mental health and physical health for the people involved in the program. So that was the second piece. And then the third piece was then to say, well, if we can achieve positive outcomes, what does that mean and how do we quantify that in dollar terms to link to the investment? And so we were able to look at the likelihood of people with disabilities who are unemployed getting jobs, which was, it turned out, about 4 times lower than for people who are unemployed that don't have a disability. And then we could see that if you can get it into a job, go from unemployed to employed, there's really significant income impacts based on the public data for those individuals and their families. But there's also a reduction in their long-term usage of the healthcare system and of course also a reduction in their use of MSD. So we could add all that up and get to, in that case, about I think it was a $2 or $3 return per dollar invested.
It's amazing. But how accurate is it? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, you must have looked at a whole range of different models used by governments globally and it's seen a gap in the market here where, or a need, perhaps we would describe it, to develop this tool that Impact Lab has championed. But how do we know it's real?
Yeah, so I think the processes by which people make positive changes in their lives are complicated and quite unique to each person. So it can be very challenging to measure. And I think for that reason, a lot of the time we don't get started. Because, for example, we can't use the tools you can in other sort of scientific fields like randomized control trials. It's really difficult to do those in a social sector context. And so it's easy to kind of say it's too hard basket. But our kind of view at Impact Lab is to improve the quality of the data, we need to use the data that we have. So oftentimes these models have a lot of uncertainty in them. They have a lot of assumptions, but we can often see a lot more than what we thought was possible. And then once we've got a view of what we know, we can then start to build on and improve that. So, for example, one of the things we look at in our modelling is engagement rates. So if you're running a 12-week parenting program, how many people are staying for the full 12 weeks and how many people are leaving after the first 2 weeks of the program? That's one important piece of information which many charities don't know because they've not been invested in to track that kind of data. But we've worked with charities that have gone through the process and seen, wow, like we're losing a lot of people early in the program. Why is that, and what can we do about that? So immediately there's action that they can take to learn and improve, even though we don't know the full story.
Well, you've touched on my next question, which is why do NGOs need this data? And you're kind of suggesting that, well, for reforms to improve their offering, is there and that would make sense that they're learning through the process of working with Impact Lab. Why else do we need this data?
Yeah, so I think the learning is the big thing, especially because most charities don't have much time or brain space to get outside of business as usual, what needs to be done day to day. So having a partner like Impact Lab come in and support teams to take a moment to step out and look at that bird's eye view, I think is a really powerful process. And also to get a bit of a sense of, how you sit maybe against what else is going on or what else is known about effective practice. So I think that's the key one. The other really important thing is being able to tell your impact story in a different way. So, a lot of charities, I think, do a fantastic job of telling the really critical human stories of people who've been through their programs. But we're finding it can be really helpful to put alongside that some of the, the quantified data and the evidence base to support that story and to really demonstrate to funders the confidence they can have about the long-term impacts that a charity is having.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask about, I guess, your drivers personally, Marie. I mean, like, if the NGOs in New Zealand are running efficiently, effectively, data-informed, they're meeting the needs of their client bases, what's the end game that you're seeking to achieve here? What's the value overall that you're hoping to see in the world?
Yeah. So I was really fortunate to speak at an event last year at the Champion Centre, which is a charity in Christchurch that works with young people in the first 5 years of life who have significant disabilities and developmental delays from things like traumatic brain injury. And it really kind of reminded me of why I'm doing the work, because I got to speak a bit about our partnership to do the measurement on Champion Centre. But before I spoke, a young woman called Bella spoke, who had been through the program as a child alongside her father and her family. And she described what her life has been like since then. So she had a significant disability. And she was supported through the program to get a really good quality education. She's now in work. She is living independently with flatmates. She has friends. And she just said, I love my life. And to me, that's the end game. The end game is that all New Zealanders can live the lives that they choose and can love their lives and can have the same right to form their aspirations for the future and to go after those. So I think we have a responsibility as a community and as a wider society to invest in ways that remove the barriers to that happening. Yeah. So that's what we hope to contribute to in a very small way. But I think, if we can build the confidence of funders and support a linking up of our joint aspirations to improve people's lives, then there's huge opportunity to do a lot more of it.
This week, today, the new government's being sworn in. How can government partner better with you and with NGOs in this work?
So I think government has an absolutely critical role to play, obviously in delivering kind of core mainstream social services. But I think there's a real opportunity for government, in a sense, to look over the fence a little bit to the community sector and really identify opportunities to enable and invest in fantastic transformational work that's already happening in those communities. So, particularly for that, the New Zealanders with the most complex lives, often what they need is something quite different to how government is typically organised. They need services that are highly adaptive, highly responsive, that really focus on building long-term trust. We worked recently with a youth mentoring group called I Have a Dream, who work with kids from the age of 5 all the way through to 18 in a mentoring kind of relationship alongside their schooling. And so that kind of continuity of relationship is something that's very difficult for any government agency to provide, just because of the realities of sort of large-scale service provision. So I think, for government to look over the fence, look at where the community sector is doing great work that can be enabled. But, I'd say to trust but verify. So, trust the organisations that they're funding and partnering with, but also verify the outcomes of that through a good flow of data and information.
You've had quite a few years now with Impact Lab. I mean, there's obviously more organisations to work with and scalability, and then continuing to work with some of the same NGOs as well. But aside from growth there, in the data part of the business and the analytics tool, is there R&D happening in that space as well for you? Or
Absolutely, and it's really hard, to be honest, to decide where to focus, because there are so many opportunities to build the knowledge base of the sector. So at the moment, what we're quite focused on is something you mentioned, which is remeasurement. So, if you're a charity and you can go through a process like this and get some kind of baseline about what the data shows around who you're reaching, how you're engaging people, and what some of those long-term impacts and outcomes might be, how do you kind of move forward from there? So we're at the moment piloting with a lot of our existing customers. How do we then remeasure, come back in, say, 12 months or in 2 years' time, and see what's changed, update the model and analyse together what's going on and what that means for decisions the charity can make now and in the future. So, for example, we're working with a charity on some scenarios. They're currently supporting, positive mental health and resilience for kids in a bunch of schools. But they face a choice. Do we invest in putting more counsellors into the existing schools we're in so that they can provide more intensive support to children? Or do we invest in expanding geographically and going to more schools and more suburbs? So we can use these kinds of models just to help unpack the implications of different decisions, and therefore support both the decision making but also the business case to funders for these next stages of evolutions within organisations.
Amazing. So for NGO people working in NGOs or social services that might be listening and thinking about engaging in this tool, it's an easy process too. It's not a long process. You've designed something very usable, haven't you? What would you say to someone wondering, is this for me, and is it at all humanly possible for us to do everything we need to in the delivery space and also be collecting data and data informed?
Yeah, so we've tried to make it as simple as we can, but it really is the kind of process that the more you put in, the more value you get in terms of the quality of the metrics at the other end. So typically when we work with organisations, it's a 4 to 6 month process, and a lot of the time is really upfront. So it can be anywhere from kind of 2 to 7 days worth of the frontline team's time to unpack with us the story of what you're achieving and the mission you have, but also to pull together the data. And I would say that's where organisations can be very different in terms of their level of data maturity. So to go through the social return on investment process, we need to at least know how many people are being engaged in a program and what it costs. But if you know more, then we can have a much kind of richer conversation around the impact. So I would say, just get on the journey in some way or another, even if it's just starting to articulate as a team, this is what we're seeking to achieve for whom and why. And these are some indicators that would tell us whether we're on the right track or not. I think that's always a helpful place to start. But going through the conversation with a third party can also be really useful, because then you get the challenge and you get that space for the hard conversations that's quite hard to carve out when everyone involved is in it.
The social value per person, I'll keep coming back when we've talked about this. I'm in the arts. Throw you the challenge, Maria, to develop a tool social value per person tool that we can use to evaluate the work of the art gallery, for example, or going to a theatre or music concert, because the economic impact tool we use is not comprehensive. It's focused on tourism, and of course a big number of the public engaging in arts and culture have well-being and social and educative values that they're extracting from those experiences that can't be captured by how many bed nights were sold in a city during a yacht race, for example. So I wonder, how do we get a social value per person or social impact tool that can measure the impact of the cultural sector?
Yeah, it's a question I'm also really fascinated by, being a keen sort of musician and enjoyer of the arts. And it's something that we've been grappling with over the past few years alongside our customers. So what's been really interesting to see is particularly in the space of youth development and young people, there are some young people for whom culture is one of, or perhaps the key way that they can build their self-confidence, build a sense of competency and a sense of community. And it can be the thing that actually is the platform for success, both in education and afterwards, in terms of both, career pathways and also the kind of friendships that people make when they engage with cultural activities. So we've been fortunate to look at some amazing programs, including one in Hawke's Bay called Project Prima Volta, which is a fascinating program. It's based on opera and getting kids who have never maybe even heard of opera or never heard an opera, but who, kind of like singing and are interested to do this opera-based youth development program over a period of months with a group of kids from all over the region, all different schools, but working together on those kind of core ethics of teamwork, discipline, musicality. And we were able to measure actually quite a lot of really great outcomes, or estimate a lot of great outcomes that can come from this kind of approach, both for how young people engage with their education, but also their mental health, their physical health, because of the disciplines they're learning through the training. And then in some cases, really escalation to career paths as opera singers, which they would never have considered before. So I think there's a lot that is measurable, particularly for programs reaching out to young people or to people who face a lot of barriers to the benefits that cultural-based programs can provide. Having said that, there's the space of the intangible that can't really be measured with hard data is enormous, and that's where I think we've got to be quite humble about the potential of these kinds of methodologies. And we need to look to other ways of getting the stories and the feedback from those who are going to the gallery or going to the museum and having an experience that really affects them.
Well, I can't wait to see what you do next. And I do hope it's in the arts space, because I know the Auckland Art Gallery and my colleagues across the cultural sector in New Zealand would greatly benefit from understanding more about the impact that we have in people's lives, and then I guess the ability to tailor our offerings better to what is a really broad public. Thanks so much for joining me today, Maria. It's been lovely to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Cultured Conversations. You can dip into other episodes at iHeartRadio or Business Desk or any of your favourite podcast platforms.